accepted an alien marriage deal, unaware my bride was the queen of everything. Julian stood on the observation deck of the Void Runner, his fingers tracing the cold glass as the nebula outside swirled in shades of violent violet. He had signed the contract to save his family's shipyard, agreeing to marry a high-ranking official of the Zalosian fleet. But the woman walking toward him now did not look like a mere bureaucrat. Tala moved with a predatory grace, her skin a soft, iridescent hue that caught the artificial light, and her eyes held the weight of entire star systems. She wore a gown of liquid metal that clung to every curve of her athletic frame, revealing the strength beneath her elegance. Julian felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the ship's life support systems as she stopped mere inches from him. He was a human, a species often dismissed as erratic, yet the way she looked at him suggested he was the most interesting thing in the quadrant. "You are smaller than the reports suggested," Tala said, her voice a low hum that vibrated in Julian's chest. "I find that being compact makes it easier to crawl into reactor cores," Julian replied, offering a sharp, confident grin. "Is that where you intend to spend our wedding night, engineer?" Tala asked, her lips curving into a smirk that challenged him. "I had much more biological functions in mind," Julian said, his gaze dropping to the pulse points on her neck. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing against the side of her jaw, a bold move for a human dealing with Zylosian royalty. Tala didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her breath hitching in a way that signaled a hunger she couldn't quite hide. The status dynamics between them were clear. She was the power, and he was the pawn, but Julian's posture remained relaxed, his shoulders broad and his stance wide. He wasn't intimidated by her status or the guards flanking the doorway, and that lack of fear seemed to intoxicate her. She grabbed his wrist, her grip firm and demanding, and pulled him toward the private quarters of the ship. The doors hissed shut behind them, sealing away the hum of the galaxy and leaving only the sound of their synchronized breathing. Tala turned to him, her fingers working the fastens of her gown with an urgency that spoke of a long-denied desire. Julian stepped in, his hands finding the small of her back, pulling her flush against his chest so she could feel the heat radiating from him. Human biology was a furnace compared to the cooler internal temperatures of her species, and she let out a soft moan as she pressed her face into the crook of his neck. He began to trail kisses along her shoulder, his teeth grazing her skin just enough to elicit a shiver that racked her entire body. "They said humans were unpredictable," Tala whispered, her hands tangling in his dark hair. "We are also very thorough," Julian murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "Show me," Tala commanded, her eyes flashing with a regal fire. Julian didn't hesitate, his hands moving with the same efficiency he used on a failing engine, but with a tenderness that made Tala's knees weak. He stripped away the remnants of her gown, marveling at the bioluminescent patterns that began to glow across her skin as her arousal peaked. He lifted her easily, carrying her to the wide, levitating bed that dominated the room, and laid her down like a precious resource he intended to mine. The intimacy was immediate and overwhelming, a collision of two vastly different worlds meeting in the most primal way possible. As he moved over her, the contrast of his tanned, scarred skin against her smooth, glowing form created a visual symphony of human resilience and alien beauty. As the days passed, Julian realized the marriage deal was far more complex than a simple trade agreement. They were currently orbiting a gas giant, where a massive orbital platform served as the seat of Zylosian power, and Tala spent her mornings in secluded meetings. Julian, restless and observant, spent his time in the engineering bays, winning over the local crew with his ability to fix unfixable, atmospheric stabilizers using nothing but spare wire and intuition. He noticed the way the high-ranking generals bowed lower to Tala than they did to the supposed king, a man Julian had yet to even see. One evening, while Tala was draped across a chair in their suite, looking exhausted, Julian knelt behind her and began to massage the tension from her neck. "Why does everyone look at you like they're waiting for an execution order?" Julian asked, his thumbs digging into a particularly tight knot. "Because I am the one who gives them," Tala sighed, her head falling back against his stomach. "I thought you were a diplomat," Julian said, pausing his movements. I am the queen of the hegemony, Julian, Tala revealed, turning in his arms to face him. I suppose that explains the high-quality sheets, Julian joked, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The revelation changed nothing and everything. He was a human commoner married to the most powerful woman in the sector, yet in this room, she was just a woman who craved his touch. She reached up, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of wine and desperation, as if she were trying to anchor herself to his solid, uncomplicated reality. Julian felt a protective instinct flare up, a uniquely human trait that saw a challenge and refused to back down. He knew now that his presence here wasn't just for trade. He was her secret weapon, the one variable the political vipers around her couldn't calculate. The peace was shattered when the orbital platform shuddered under the impact of a coordinated strike from a separatist faction. Red lights strobed through the living quarters, and the hum of the gravity generators began to fluctuate wildly. Tala was on her feet in an instant, her regal mask snapping into place, but Julian saw the flicker of worry in her eyes. The coup had begun, and the bridge reported that the main reactor had been sabotaged with a dampening field that no Xylosian technology could penetrate. Without power, the platform's shields would fail, and they would be shredded by the incoming fleet. We have to evacuate, Tala said, her voice tight as she reached for her sidearm. If we leave, you lose the throne and the platform, Julian countered, already grabbing his tool kit. The reactor is shielded by a tachyon lock, Julian. It's a death trap, Tala warned, grabbing his arm. It's a machine, Tala, and I'm a human, Julian said, kissing her hard before breaking for the door. He sprinted through the smoky corridors, ignoring the screams of the wounded and the smell of scorched circuitry. When he reached the reactor core, he found a team of alien engineers standing back in despair, their sophisticated tools useless against the crude, effective sabotage. Julian didn't use a scanner. He put his ear to the humming metal, listening for the disharmony in the vibration. He realized the saboteurs had used a simple mechanical bypass to flood the cooling vents with a non-conductive sludge. It was a low-tech solution that baffled the high-tech aliens, but to a man who grew up in a scrapyard, it was a Tuesday afternoon. Julian stripped to his waist, the heat in the crawlspace rising to a blistering degree that would have wilted a Xylosian. He squeezed into the narrow vent, his skin slick with sweat and grease, his muscles straining as he wrenched a heavy valve shut by hand. The metal burned his palms, but he didn't let go, screaming through the pain as he forced the bypass to reset. Above him, he could hear the reactor beginning to pulse with renewed life as the dampening field was flushed out. He scrambled back out just as the emergency coolant sprayed into the chamber, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body covered in soot and minor burns. He returned to the command center to find Tala standing over a hologram of the retreating enemy fleet, her expression one of cold triumph. When she saw him, her composure broke for a split second, her eyes raking over his battered form with a mix of horror and adoration. She didn't care who was watching. She crossed the deck in 3 long strides and pulled him into a fierce embrace. The bridge crew, composed of some of the most stoic beings in the galaxy, watched in stunned silence as their queen clung to a sweating, grease-stained human. "You fixed it," Tala whispered into his chest. "I told you I was good with my hands," Julian panted, a weak smile playing on his lips. "You are insane," Tala said, pulling back to look at his burnt palms. "It's a human specialty," Julian replied, his eyes locking onto hers. The political aftermath was swift, as Tala used the momentum of the failed coup to purge the traitors from her court. Julian became a legend overnight, the human who had saved the hegemony with a wrench and a stubborn refusal to die. However, the fame meant little to him compared to the quiet moments they shared in the wake of the battle. They sat on the balcony of the royal palace, the air thick with the scent of night-blooming flora, watching the stars they had fought to keep. Tala traced the scars on his arms, her touch light and reverent, her iridescence glowing a soft, contented blue. "My advisors want to know what title to give you," Tala said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Chief Grease Monkey sounds about right," Julian suggested, his eyes closed. "I was thinking Prince Consort," Tala countered, her hand sliding down his chest. Does that come with a pay raise? Julian asked, his hand finding hers. It comes with certain fringe benefits, Tala murmured, her lips brushing his ear. She stood up, pulling him with her toward the grand sleeping chambers, her intentions clear in the way her hips swayed. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer a pawn or a secret weapon, but an equal partner in a way the Zalosians had never seen. Human ingenuity had saved her crown, but it was his human heart, and the fire in his blood, that had captured her soul. As they entered the room, the heavy doors locking behind them, Julian realized that the marriage deal was the best contract he had ever signed. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders, but as he pulled the queen into his arms, he knew he had already found the greatest one. The weeks that followed were a blur of state dinners and private intensity that pushed the limits of Julian's endurance. Tala insisted on his presence at every council meeting, much to the chagrin of the traditionalists who viewed humans as chaotic. During a particularly dull session regarding mineral rights, Julian felt Tala's foot slide up his calf under the massive stone table. He kept his expression neutral, even as she shifted her weight, her eyes fixed on a data pad while her toes teased the hem of his formal trousers. He reached down, catching her ankle and squeezing it firmly, a silent promise of what would happen once the doors were closed. The Trade Federation requires a signature on the lithium accords. A tall, spindly advisor named Alcyone noted, oblivious to the tension. The Queen will review them after the evening meal, Julian answered for her, his voice steady despite the heat pooling in his gut. Is that so, Julian? Tala asked, her voice dipping into that dangerous, sultry register. Unless you have a more pressing engagement, Julian said, his thumb circling her ankle bone. Tala dismissed the council with a sharp wave of her hand, and the room cleared in seconds. As soon as the last advisor vanished, she was in his lap, her arms wrapping around his neck with a ferocity that nearly sent his chair backward. She kissed him with a hunger that spoke of hours spent maintaining a royal facade, her tongue dancing with his in a desperate, beautiful rhythm. Julian's hands found the curves of her hips, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them, the silk of his shirt a thin barrier to the warmth of her skin. I hate those meetings, Tala breathed against his lips. You seem to be handling yourself well, Julian teased, his hands sliding lower. I was imagining what I'm about to do to you, Tala said, her eyes darkening. Then why are we still in the council chambers? Julian asked, his breath hitching as she nipped at his jaw. He stood up without breaking the kiss, his strength surprising her as he lifted her onto the polished surface of the council table. He swept the data pads and crystal carafes aside, the clatter echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Tala laughed, a rare, genuine sound of joy as she arched her back, her glowing skin reflecting off the dark stone. Julian moved between her legs, his touch deliberate and masterful, reminding her that while she ruled the hegemony in this moment, he was the one in control. The contrast of human passion against the cold, calculated world of alien politics was a victory in itself. Their bond wasn't just physical. It was a fusion of two tactical minds that the rest of the galaxy was starting to fear. When a neighboring empire, the Dran, attempted to blockade a vital jump gate, Tala turned to Julian for a solution that didn't involve a full-scale war. Julian spent 48 hours in the tactical suite, drinking black coffee and staring at sensor ghosts until he found a flaw in the Dran's automated targeting systems. He proposed a ghost fleet, a series of small, unmanned probes outfitted with human-made signal amplifiers that would mimic the signature of a massive dreadnought. It's a bluff, Tala said, looking at the schematics. It's a human bluff, Julian corrected. They won't know it's empty until we're already through the gate. And if they call it, Tala asked, her eyes searching his. Then I'll be on the lead probe, personally overriding their sensors, Julian said, his voice devoid of doubt. You will stay on the bridge with me, Tala commanded, her hand resting on his chest. The plan worked perfectly. The Dran, faced with what appeared to be an overwhelming force that ignored all standard tactical logic, blinked first and opened the gate. The Zylosian fleet sailed through without firing a single shot, a feat of strategic brilliance that was credited to the human prince. That night, the celebration in the palace was subdued but deeply intimate. Tala led Julian to the gardens, away from the prying eyes of the court, where the air was cool and the moon cast a silver glow over the reflecting pools. She turned to him, her expression soft, the weight of her crown seemingly lifted for the night. "You keep surprising me," Tala said, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Is that a good thing for a queen?" Julian asked, leaning into her touch. "It is a wonderful thing for a woman," Tala replied, her voice a whisper. She reached for the buttons of his jacket, her movements slow and deliberate, savoring the anticipation. Julian watched her, his heart full of a strange, fierce love for this alien woman who had seen the worth in his species. He pulled her into a slow dance under the stars, their bodies moving in perfect harmony, a testament to the bridge they had built between their worlds. The romance was an anchor in the chaos of galactic life, a private sanctuary where they were simply Julian and Tala. As the night deepened, they disappeared into the shadows of the garden, their laughter and whispers lost to the wind. However, the galaxy was never quiet for long, and a new threat emerged from the deep void, a swarm of autonomous drones from a long-dead civilization, triggered by the recent conflict. These drones didn't negotiate and couldn't be bluffed. They simply consumed everything in their path for raw materials. The hegemony's outer colonies were the first to fall, and the Zylosian military was paralyzed by the drones' ability to hack and disable their networked weapon systems. Tala stood before her war table, her face a mask of grief as the casualty reports poured in. Julian stood by her side, his mind already racing through possibilities, looking for the human edge in a war of machines. "Our ships are being turned against us," Tala said, her voice trembling slightly. "Then we stop using networked ships," Julian said, pointing to the mothballed fleet of manual control scouts in the hangar. "Those are relics, Julian. They require physical pilots for every system," Tala argued. "Exactly," Julian said, a grim light in his eyes. "The drones can't hack a pilot's brain." "We don't have enough pilots trained for manual flight," Tala noted, her hope flickering. "You have one," Julian said, "and I can train 50 more in 3 days if they have the guts." The training was brutal. Julian took the best Zylosian pilots and stripped them of their automated crutches, forcing them to rely on their senses and reflexes. He led from the cockpit, his human nervous system proving to be more adaptable to the rapid-fire inputs of manual flight. During the rare breaks, Tala would visit the hangars, bringing him food and just watching him work. One night found him asleep under the wing of a scout ship, a wrench still clutched in his hand. She sat beside him, stroking his hair, her heart aching with the realization of how much he was risking for her people. "Wake up, my brave human," Tala whispered, kissing his forehead. "Is it time to go?" Julian asked, his eyes snapping open. "Not yet," Tala said, pulling him into her lap. "I'm a mess, Tala," Julian muttered, smelling of fuel and sweat. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Tala said, her voice thick with emotion. She took him right there, in the shadow of the war machine, a desperate and intense encounter that served as a final goodbye before the battle. The passion was raw, a middle finger to the cold vacuum of space and the machines that sought to end them. Julian poured everything into her, his strength, his fear, and his unyielding human will. When it was over, they lay on the cold hangar floor, their breathing the only sound in the massive space. Tala held him tight, as if she could keep him safe through sheer force of will, her glowing skin the only light in the darkness. The battle for the capital was a chaotic dance of fire and metal. Julian led the manual fleet into the heart of the drone swarm, his ship dodging and weaving through patterns that no computer could predict. He was a blur of motion, his hands flying over the controls, his human intuition allowing him to sense the gaps in the drone's logic. Behind him, the Zylosian pilots followed his lead, their fear replaced by a fierce, human-inspired determination. On the bridge of the flagship, Tala watched the tactical display, her heart in her throat as Julian's signal flickered in and out of the most dangerous sectors. "He's heading for the hive ship," Alcyone shouted, his voice full of disbelief. "He's going to manual detonate the core," Tala realized, her hand gripping the rail so hard the metal groaned. Julian flew into the maw of the massive drone mothership, The narrow tunnel's a nightmare of jagged edges and defensive turrets. He didn't blink. His focus narrowed down to a single point of light. He released the payload and banked his ship into a bone-crushing turn, the G-force threatening to black him out. The explosion was a miniature sun, tearing the hive ship apart and sending a feedback loop through the remaining drones. The swarm went dark, their lights fading like dying embers, and for a moment the comms were silent. "Julian, respond," Tala whispered into the open channel, her voice breaking. "Little busy back here, Tala," Julian's voice crackled through, followed by a cough. "Status," Tala demanded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm out of fuel, the wings are gone, and I think I left my favorite wrench in there," Julian reported, his voice weak but triumphant. "We are coming for you," Tala promised, her voice echoing through the bridge. The recovery team found him drifting in the wreckage, his cockpit cracked but his life support holding. When they brought him back to the flagship, Tala was waiting in the bay, pushing past the medics to get to him. Julian stepped out of the craft, his flight suit shredded, blood trickling down his temple, but he was walking. He looked at her and shrugged, as if he hadn't just saved a civilization from extinction. Tala didn't say a word. She simply grabbed his face and kissed him with a ferocity that told him he was never going back to a shipyard again. The victory solidified the alliance between Earth and the hegemony, but more importantly, it solidified the legend of Julian and Tala. They became a symbol of what was possible when human grit met alien grace. Years later, Julian sat in the royal gardens, a young girl with iridescent skin and human eyes playing at his feet. Tala approached him, her regal robes trailing behind her, a look of peace on her face that she had once thought impossible. She sat beside him, taking his scarred hand in hers, their fingers interlocking perfectly. "The Council is complaining about the new human-designed engines," Tala remarked, her eyes twinkling. "They're too fast for them," Julian asked, leaning back. "They say they're unnecessarily loud," Tala laughed. "That's just the sound of progress," Julian said, pulling her close. The galaxy continued to spin, full of threats and wonders, but they were ready for whatever came next. Julian had accepted a marriage deal to save a company, never realizing he was signing up to save a queen and find his soul. As the suns set over the capital, casting long shadows across the world they had built together, Julian knew that humanity's greatest strength wasn't its technology or its tactics. It was the ability to love across the stars, to find a home in the most unlikely of places, and to prove, time and time again, that the human spirit was the most powerful force in the universe. "Would you like me to create an image of Julian and Tala in their royal garden?"